Delia Pompa. I'm a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to the call centering English learners and schools' responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are very pleased to be able to do this call. I think all of us who are in the field have noted that the educational inequities that sort of beset English learners have been magnified by this pandemic, and so there are many questions about how to serve them best, and we hope to start talking today about many solutions. Our responses are going to be on a policy level, and we really do hope it begins to spark conversation at the district level and the state level about what policies could be adopted to support the best learning for English learners during this time. First, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any technical problems, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. We're going to have questions and answers at the end of the call, and we hope to leave plenty of time for that because we think there'll be a lot of them. It won't be a voice Q&A where you call in, but we'd like for you to type any questions you have into the question and answer or chat box on the right side of your screen and send it to the host or me, or email it to events@migrationpolicy.org. Or you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. So, with that said, we are looking for your questions that are going to start anytime soon, and I want to introduce briefly all our presenters. We are very fortunate to have two of the authors of one of our publications on COVID, Melissa Lazarin and Julie Sugarman, who actually have been doing the work researching what's happening around the country and thinking through what policies should be and could be affected by this pandemic to better education for English learners. Then we're very fortunate to have two speakers from the field who are going to talk about particularly what's happening in their locales in the state of California and in Nashville Public Schools, their responses. Shelley Spiegel-Coleman from California and Molly Hegwood, who is the Executive Director of English Learners at Metro Nashville Public Schools. So before we start, I just want to say a little bit about Migration Policy Institute, National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. That's us. There's a wide variety of folks in our audience today, and not all of whom have worked in the past with us. But we do work in education and training from early childhood through adult education and workforce development. We've been focused in the past on a large array of issues facing English learners, beginning with the issue of language access. And our work is focused on the integration of English learners, immigrant students and their families into the institutions of the United States when they come here. Moving ahead, I hope you all have had the opportunity to see two of our publications that sort of form the basis for the work we're going to talk about today and the ideas we're going to talk about today. One is a policy brief, Educating English Learners During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Policy Ideas for States and School Districts. You see the bit.ly there. You see where you can go and find that on our website. Also, there was a shorter commentary that focused on what the inequities that are facing English learners are, and how many nonprofit organizations around the country are working with school districts to mitigate these challenges. You'll find both of those on our website. I also just want to point out right now that this is the first in a series on the effects of the pandemic. We'll be doing 3 more, and you can watch out for information on when that will happen. So, let me start by introducing our two MPI folks on the call today. Melissa Lazarin has vast experience working on issues related to immigrant children and English learners. She is a senior advisor for K-12 policy at the National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy at MPI. Her background includes a wide range of educational policy issues related to English learners, and she has an impressive record of employment at several organizations in Washington, D.C., focusing on policy. Then I also want to introduce Julie Sugarman, who is a senior policy analyst for pre-K-12 education at MPI at the center. Julie has done research for a number of years on topics that affect immigrant and English learner students. I bet many of you have read some of her work. It's wide-ranging also, looking at issues ranging from funding all the way to direct high-quality instructional services for these children, and looking at the needs in particular of newcomer students. Julie has worked in Washington, D.C., and was a long-time researcher at the Center for Applied Linguistics. So I'm going to turn this over now to Melissa, who is going to talk about some of the work that she and Julie have done.
Good morning. Thank you, Delia. I will go ahead and jump in, but great to have so many people on the line. As you know, many of the country's school districts are not open in person, or many are offering a hybrid option for parents and children. The move to remote instruction since March has left English learners behind. And I'm sure I don't need to belabor this point, since we all have been hearing the stories of how students, especially low-income Black, Latino, immigrant, and English learners, students with disabilities as well, are facing some extreme challenges with remote learning. There are many reasons for this: technological, language access, balancing family responsibilities, economic stress, that these groups are disproportionately or more, and the fact that these groups are disproportionately more affected by the virus. But very briefly, I'm just going to outline three of the major impacts of COVID on ELs with respect to education. So the first is English language development. The obvious is that ELs are spending less instructional time on English language development and formal instruction. However, there are somewhat less concrete opportunities that ELs have lost access to, or at least have a lot less of. One important component of EL instructional programs, but that school offers in general, is facilitating opportunities to engage in collaborative peer learning and productive talk in English with classmates. This is really critical to oral language development, and many ELs may not get as many opportunities to speak and hear English or even write and read it outside of school. And so as a result, their English language development may stall. And some of this is visible in research on how more typical summer months affect EL's vocabulary, not so much the one that we just had. And there is also some research on chronic absenteeism, which included a small sample of ELs that found that ELs who were chronically absent in kindergarten and first grade scored lower on the ELP assessment in second and third grade. So some of these effects may be here for some time, even after the pandemic is resolved. Second, academic development. NWEA put out some estimates early in the pandemic, and these estimates were really focused on the effects of the spring 2020 school closures, which did not fully take into account what schooling looks like now, this new academic year. These are also estimates for all students in general, so not specific to ELs. And another analysis considered the quality of remote instruction and the degree to which students participated in remote instruction, and students who participate in remote instruction of average quality could lose 3 to 4 months of learning, and possibly 7 to 11 months with lower quality distance learning, and 12 to 14 months if they do not participate in remote instruction at all, which we know is happening for a subset of students. There are also estimates of what this may mean for high school dropouts. An additional 9% of high school students, or 1.1 million, could drop out. And we feel the stakes are especially high for newcomer ELs in secondary schools, who we're already facing a great deal of challenges under normal circumstances. And I should say that these are the estimates in both of these accounts are estimate to be more for Black and Hispanic and low-income students. Third, finally, the social emotional development impacts. Immigrants are disproportionately represented in occupations critical to the nation's response to the pandemic. They must often choose between their job and homeschooling and childcare. Older immigrant youth we're seeing might be managing their siblings, schooling, and care along with their own. Immigrants are disproportionately affected by some of the job losses that we've seen in the last few months. And immigrant communities are especially vulnerable to the virus. It has perhaps not been so clear and so visible than now how students' quote-unquote non-academic world affects their learning, and how inequity of opportunity and discrimination and racism affect schooling every day. So as dire as the circumstances are, this is a real wake-up call and a unique opportunity to modify and improve how our school systems work for ELs. We hope that is a little bit of the silver lining that comes about, is that this is a new opportunity. And with that, we're going to turn to my colleague, Julie Sugarman, to review some policy recommendations.
Thanks, Melissa. And I am going to go through the policy recommendations really very quickly. These are all discussed in the brief that we put out last week, and there was a slide earlier with the URL for you to go to. So any additional details you'll be able to find there, or we can talk about in the Q&A. So our first set of policy recommendations focuses on providing instructional support for English learners. As Melissa said, many school districts started this year entirely remotely, and for those that are still working on their reopening plans, our recommendation is to prioritize ELs for in-person instruction when it's safe to have students back on campus. Related to this, ELs will need increased learning time for language and academic enrichment, which may include before school, after school, or Saturday programs, and of course summer school in 2021. Many districts have worked extremely hard to pivot to online learning, but we worry that too many teachers still don't know how to support ELs remotely. Both EL specialists and general education teachers should receive training on instructional strategies to support comprehension and language development. They also need to know how to select and adapt supplementary learning materials to ensure they're appropriate for ELs. Perhaps most importantly, school systems should be facilitating opportunities for teachers to share what's been working for them with peers inside and outside their school. While most of the public's focus has been on schools and districts, state education agencies are important partners to ensure a systemic and equity-focused response to school building closures. For example, schools are provisionally identifying new students as ELs in cases where they can't do the formal testing required for an official identification. States should be tracking how many students are being provisionally identified to ensure that all schools are following the guidelines. Earlier this month, a coalition of education equity advocates suggested that Congress enact a new regulation called a Maintenance of Equity provision to ensure that states taking federal dollars shield low-income districts from the brunt of budget cuts. Whether that's taken up by Congress or not, States should make sure that their most under-resourced districts, and including ones serving a large number of ELs, don't face disproportionate funding cuts. Districts can take the same approach with their most under-resourced schools. Likewise, states should be sure that discretionary dollars from state and federal relief funds go to meet EL needs. And this would be a good time for states to review whether their state funding formulas and grants provide adequate funding for ELs. We know they're working in difficult circumstances, but many schools and districts have not done a good job engaging immigrant families and parents with limited English proficiency. Schools and districts should ensure they prioritize meaningful two-way communication about remote learning and reopening, including making sure they have sufficient translation and interpretation services and that those services are consistently used. Educational leaders should also heed the lessons from the last 6 months to recognize the importance of providing parents with digital literacy instruction to help them support their children. One important strategy in this area is for school systems to build partnerships with community-based organizations who can provide invaluable services, reaching out to immigrant families that may be struggling and providing supports that schools don't have the bandwidth to provide. Policymakers will need to address how interruptions to the normal cycle of English language proficiency testing may affect the data we rely on. Many states count students for funding purposes in September or October, but if new enrollees from the last 6 months only have provisional identification as ELs, they may not count as ELs for supplementary state and federal funding. Most states have not yet announced policies for how to ensure those counts are correct. Although states won't have to report accountability data for last year, they should start thinking about how to make sure the English language proficiency indicator they use for accountability will provide accurate and fair judgments of student language development over the next year or two. For example, some states don't give students credit for ELP growth if they have exceeded a maximum number of years to achieve proficiency, and those states might want to reconsider that for the near future. Finally, states should ensure that schools are collecting consistent data on EL engagement in remote learning, as this will be an important early metric for getting a handle on how much learning loss has taken place. So Dahlia, that's what we wrote about in the paper, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Shelley and Molly talking about how this all looks on the ground.
Yeah, Julie, thank you. As you can see, we have lots of questions as we look at the future of English learners, the near future, and we also have, what we think, a number of good policy recommendations that states and districts should consider. So in that vein, I want to introduce Shelley Spiegel-Coleman, who will be talking about what's happening in California. Shelley is currently Strategic Advisor to Californians Together, but you may know her in her previous position, long-held position, where she was founder and Executive Director of Californians Together. Shelley's had a long career serving English learners, and we're fortunate that she has decided to stick around and continue to do the work. Shelley, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you so much, Delia and Julie and Melissa, for the important report that you released last week, and we are looking forward to your upcoming additional reports in the series. I think they really help us in the field tremendously. As Delia and Melissa and Julie said, we in California were very concerned about the spring distance learning and the disproportional negative effect on English learners. In California, at the beginning of July, every single school district had to submit a report on what they did for distance learning in their school districts. And what we chose to do as Californians Together is to review those reports. And you can see there's a bit.ly there where you can get the full report for us, or you can go to our website and download it also. And in the report, we read 79 school district reports that represented 44% of all the English learners in California, 35% of all the students in California. You can see how we made the determination of selecting those districts. We scored for 6 different components: designated and integrated ELD, that's structured ELD, as well as English language development during content delivery, live interactive instruction, bridging the digital divide, family collaboration, social emotional support, and early childhood education services, if any. And so we developed our own rating scales, and I just want to show you two of those for you to get a sense of what might be in the report and why we continue to do the work in this area because of our concerns. You can see that for English language development, as was said by Melissa, we heard anecdotally that it was almost non-existent. And this has kind of proved it out. In 39% of the districts, they said nothing about English language development or very minimal. In terms of live interactive instruction, for the reasons, again, that Melissa stated about the need for interaction for language development, this raised a high concern for us, and that was that 55% of the districts didn't even mention live interactive instruction was offered or very minimal, and only 15% of all the districts stated how much time. Because of that, we were very excited that during this period of time we did receive a grant from our California Department of Education that allowed us 3 years to work on implementation of a new state policy for English learners in California that really uplifts the benefits of bilingualism and biliteracy and high quality instruction and coherence in programs across districts. And so with that project, we pivoted to really trying to support districts right now for distance learning, and we developed this tool. And again, there is a bit.ly on here for you to be able to get the full tool. I'm just going to show a couple of parts of it, but what I think is really helpful for districts across the state is that we looked at 11 best practices for English learners for distance learning, and then we gave concrete examples of actions that districts and schools could do to implement those best practices. And so just for examples, the other two columns really, if you're not in California, don't worry about those other two columns. But for instance, and as Melissa had said, it is critical that the districts create schedules and resource allocations for the students who have the greatest needs, and really to provide guidance and assistance, especially for the provisions of English language development. So that's the best practice, right? And so some of the examples of what we have seen, the better of what districts are doing, those that are doing much better, is really designating dedicated English language development time, no matter what the delivery approach is, either distance learning, hybrid, or in person, and to make intentional language development during content lessons. The other thing is to provide extra periods of time for small groups, so not taking away from the full school schedule, but extra time. And you see some of the others, including extended learning enrichment sessions for students in their home language. The second best practice is really to establish relationships and mechanisms for ongoing stakeholder input. During this period of time, it really is important that teachers, parents, and even high school students have the opportunity to give input on how best to do distance learning. And in California, we have a requirement when there are 50 English learners in a district that there's a district English learner advisory committee. And those meetings did continue in the spring, and they're now continuing in the fall. And what sub-districts have found out is that in using Zoom, there is an element of Zoom where at the bottom bar that you can install called interpreters. And if you click on that, a menu will come up with different languages for which you can offer translation for meetings while they are in progress, so that no matter what language your parents speak, or at least the top maybe 5 languages, parents can be engaged in those meetings that are discussing the specific needs of their students. We have heard from districts that this has actually increased attendance at those meetings, and something that we think should be definitely considered. And especially for students who were minimally or non-engaged during the spring, we think that really there's a real need to do connectivity, to connect with them and to engage with them as to what their needs are. The other best practice with ideas for actions was really to expect the need for flexibility and change of plans and to communicate regularly with our families. And so I talked to you about the translation ability for the district or the school site meetings. The other is for teachers to connect with their parents. And there are apps now that teachers can use and administrators can use. I'm not pushing it, but one is Talking Points, where the app allows the teacher to send text messages to parents in English. It translates into the language of the parent responds in their home language. It translates back to the teachers in English. These apps generally have translations for over 100 different languages, and teachers really need to use them to really be able to communicate with the parents in their language and at a time when parents are available. The other thing is that it really is important to repurpose any bilingual staff that you have in your district or your school, be it your counselors, be it your front office staff, be it your paraeducators, be it your homeschool liaison, so that they become engaged with parents in their language to support them, to hear from them, to connect with them, and to make sure that they're engaged and that the help they need is provided. And so that you can see from this tool, and I only went over 3 of the best practices. There's 8 there with some concrete ideas. We hope you'll see them as valuable and that you download them and use them. To put it all together, I did want to show you a schedule from one of our school districts, Azusa Unified School District in Southern California. You can see from this is a distance learning schedule for TK through 6th grade. And you can see they have set aside this designated time for ELD, which is in addition to the regular distance learning schedule for other students. So from 8 to 8:45 every morning, you have your TK through 3rd grade students getting ELD, while 4th through 6th grade students are getting special ed support. They did this purposefully just in case English learners or special ed students are duly identified, so that you see later on in the day it flips. There's additional period of time there. So 4th through 6th grade students get ELD, and the TK3 students get their special ed support. The other blocks of time are live interactive instruction. They cover all areas of the curriculum. And then most importantly, there's a half an hour every day of a teacher schedule where they are connecting with families, be it one-on-one, be it small groups, students one-on-one, very small groups. But again, that issue of having a regular scheduled time where parents know they can get their teachers and teachers know they can reach out to parents. So for us in California, we want to offer you, from Californians Together, we want to offer you some of our tools and some of our materials that we've developed in the area of English learners and distance learning on our website. And we like to say, when teachers have that special relationship with students and parents feel confident that their children are getting the help they need, then we will know that school is in session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Shelley. That was a lot of information packed into a short time, and already there are lots of questions coming up about some of what you talked about. Next, we're going to turn to a local district, to Molly Hegwood, whom I introduced earlier as Executive Director of English Learners for Metro Nashville Public Schools. Molly started her career as an English learner elementary teacher, and she went on to become an English language development coach. She also has a particular interest in working with parents of English learners. So we're eager to hear from you, Molly, about what you've been doing in Nashville Public Schools as a response to this pandemic.
Having me today. I just wanted to share before I get started my contact information, because I'm going to touch on some various things that I know you'll have follow-up questions about. So my email is there. I also have my Twitter account that's a personal one and the Twitter account for our office. I'm always posting various things about this work, so please feel free to reach out to me. I want to start quickly with kind of the vision that drives everything that we do at our office, and I think you'll really see this play out in some of the things that I'm going to share about the work that we've been doing. We want to make sure that our EL students have their social, emotional, cultural, linguistic, and academic skills necessary to excel in higher education work and life. I also want to share some of the numbers about the students that we have here in Metro Nashville Public Schools. People are always surprised to see that we have over 20,000 limited English proficient students in our district. Limited English Proficient is the LEP acronym, so you'll hear me use that a few times. The Limited English Proficient group encompasses those active English learners that are receiving those direct services every day and those transitional students who have exited the program and are in the years of we're monitoring those students. When we speak about the systems and structures that we use to reopening our schools, we had to ensure that our 20,000 LEP students needs would be met across our 161 schools in Nashville that span over 526 square miles in Davidson County. So during this brief time that we have together, I'm going to share how MNPS incorporated English learners in our district-wide reopening, how we prioritized the needs of English learners, and how we leveraged our community and family partnerships in our reopening. When we quickly closed in March, as the others in the group have shared, we immediately highlighted some of the gaps in our services to English learners, and we knew that we had to address these issues at a systematic level to improve the experience for our English learners. So as we replanned our reopening for August of 2020, our director of schools made it clear to central office teams and school leaders that we must plan for equity for all learners in the reopening, and specifically English learners. So as we broke out into our planning teams, each work team had to outline how they were going to specifically meet the needs of English learners and families, and also how they were going to include interpretation services. So I'm going to highlight 4 areas that our district really focused on to ensure these supports were present. We have instructional alignment in our professional development, technology support, and device distribution. Social emotional learning with specifically a navigator role that was created for our students. And then our facilities. How do we ensure that English learners' needs were met in reopening the school buildings and also registering and assessing our students? When it comes to instructional alignment and professional development, we started this at a systems level. We knew that at the district level, we had to provide clear messaging around instructional supports for our English learners so that teachers and schools could carry this out in real time. We utilized the back to school time as we were renormed district-wide on this messaging to teachers. We provided the same message about utilizing language supports, accommodations, and grade level curriculum in all of the content area presentations. We assigned an EL instructional coach to each content team, math, science, social studies, to ensure that the supports for English learners were consistent across all content areas and curriculum. As a district, we also created virtual learning playbooks for teachers and school leaders. In these playbooks, we outlined the roles and responsibilities for working with English learners. And we specifically noted that any time there was a mention of a parent contact in those playbooks, that we added the process for utilizing an interpreter to ensure that schools followed this process in the virtual learning environment. In the spring, we quickly realized we needed to do more to provide this equity and technology support, digital literacy, and device distribution. Many of our families were given a laptop, and they did not know how to utilize the device well. Our district reopened over the summer and decided to make changes to better serve our EL families when we started up in the fall. Laptops and hotspots were distributed at schools. We also added this distribution at all of our EL registration hubs, and we opened 6 technology support hubs. When devices were picked up at the registration hubs and the technology support areas, we were able to walk the families through using the devices one-on-one. After the first 2 weeks of school, we analyzed the data and knew that our families really needed more. We had some absences. We had some families that weren't engaging yet. So we opened up 6 virtual learning tech support hubs in areas of the district with the highest number of English learners. We were able to have folks walk in and provide support to families one-on-one. This support ranged from turning on a computer and logging in all the way to accessing our virtual learning platforms and submitting assignments. Another thing that we realized that we needed to quickly change was our help desk. So in the spring, families were able to call a help desk line and get support for technology. The original phone line had an English speaker that answered, and then the English speaker then would connect with an interpreter. We realized that this was a barrier for our families, and it was just one extra step that was making it so that not all families could access this support. So we created a second line specifically for families that needed an interpreter. So on this line, the family called in. They got the interpreter first. The interpreter kind of scripted out the problem, and then the interpreter called in IT for support. This made it so that that anxiety level was down for the family, and we were immediately able to connect them with the speaker before we were able to add in the English speaker. I want to also share a little bit about the systems level that I talked about, where we really made plans to ensure that we streamline our interpretation and translation services. We want our families to receive information at the same time as their native English-speaking peers. We're continuing to work on this. It's obviously not perfect, but we're trying to make it the system focus, and so it's not left up to the schools to scramble on the back end. So one example of this system-wide focus is our translation and interpretation that we embedded into this role called a navigator. The navigator is a mentor and advocate for a small group of students. As you can see in the picture there, they navigate the different parts of the school system, and it creates this two-way communication channel. When this role was rolled out, we said, hold on a second, we want to make sure that translation and interpretation is planned out on the front end for this role, that at the school level, you have a plan for this, and there's also a catch to make sure this happens when these things are playing out at the school level. So a school had to create a plan for their navigator role. And as you can see there, part of their action plan was that they had to list how they were going to utilize an interpreter. And the plan was not approved until they did that. And then as they logged the calls each week, there was a place there for them to indicate whether they used an interpreter. And if they didn't, why not? We created pre-written scripts that went out to the schools each week. The scripts were sent to the schools and translated in the top 7 languages to ensure that every student had that translation need. And we wanted to make sure that it was consistently used. And finally, our community partners. We rely heavily on our community partners for their communication with families and their expertise. We are continuing to build on these partnerships in order to better serve our families. Use these partnerships as a way to receive feedback about our programming and for two-way communication with our families. The community partners that we work with are often in close contact with families, so we utilize this relationship to keep our pulse on how parents are feeling and to get feedback. We strive to front-load our community partners with information so they are able to communicate updates and changes if families ask. We also utilize their expertise and connections with families to stay in touch with our families. We have several examples here of our community partners. I would hate to not mention a couple of them. Conexión Americas, Hispanic Family Foundation, Tennessee Immigrant Refugee Rights Coalition, and Nashville International Center for Empowerment. And so we really work closely with these organizations to ensure that we're providing school-level support, but then we can turn it over to them for these wraparound supports for our families that they're really needed during this time. So that closes out my part. So thank you guys. And again, my contact information will be shared, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions about some of the things that we discussed.
Thank you so much, Molly. Lots going on in Nashville, and there were lots of questions that popped up about your work. We're going to open it up for Q&A. I'd like to remind you to type any questions you have into the Q&A or chat box on the right of your screen and send it to the host or email to events@migrationpolicy.org. And keep the questions coming in. There are lots of them. Also, you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or hashtag MPI discuss. So there were many, many questions about translation and the translation apps, lots of technical questions. Some of the technical questions, if you look, were answered in the chat box by other people. But I'd like to ask, in particular, Julie and, not you, Juliet, Molly and Shelley, and Julie and Melissa, please chime in if you've got something else. But beyond the sort of technical aspect of translations, what kind of environment do you have to set up with the parents? Molly, you did talk about it, but what would you emphasize that would enrich translations beyond the apps? What else did you do to make sure parents were really understanding what was going on? Either one of you, Molly or Shelley, or both.
I'd be happy to start us off on that. What we were striving to do and made improvements, and again, it wasn't perfect, but we really made it so that a family could reach an interpreter when they needed it, a live interpreter, a person that works in our district, so that they were not having to navigate through an English speaker first. So anytime that we could set up that situation made it so that we were better able to serve the families. So in those outdoor tech sites, again, it's the same thing. The interpreters are the first ones that are greeting those families.
And then this is Shelley. One of our school districts set up meetings solely for newcomer families, for parents of newcomers, and they are having those meetings regularly. They're doing it through Zoom and using the interpretation element of the Zoom app, and they were very surprised. Actually, their first meeting, they had over 100 parents that came on, newcomer parents. And so I think when you're targeting very specific groups and there are very specific needs and you make that known, I think there is a receptivity to it. And yeah.
Thanks. Julie, a question that you might begin answering, and again, everybody jump in. There was a question about how you begin to cost out the extra amount it takes to address the needs of English learners during this time. People are asking at the federal level, at the state level, how much more do we need to add to the budget to make sure English learners are taken care of during this time? If not specific numbers, what should be some considerations? Julie, and then Shelley, you might want to jump in on that too.
Sure. Yeah, this is a question I get a lot and one that's extremely hard to answer because, EL education doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of the whole enterprise of what the school does. So if funding is not adequate for the schools, in general, that's going to really have an effect on the English learners also. We see English learner states, almost all states provide additional funding for English learners, and the weights that they offer are anything from maybe 1% to doubling the amount to 100%. And it really depends on what models are used and again, how adequate the funding is in general. But I think what's really important at this time is to make sure that there are enough English learner specialists, whether those are certified EL teachers or paraprofessionals or however the states and the districts do that, or bilingual teachers, to really make sure that those positions are protected, because I think schools are going to really focus on, we have to have our regular full-time equivalent of how many, our ratio of one teacher to so many students. And some of the support teachers may be the ones that schools look to balance their budgets. And I think it's just really critical that we advocate very strongly, or that schools and communities advocate very strongly for how important it is to have those EL specialists remain in the schools because of how disproportionately great the impact has been on English learners.
Shelley, did you want to add anything there?
important. Basic needs such as English language development, access to a full curriculum, and language development during content instruction, those ought to be base program requirements. And whether or not you have an extra pot of money or not, schools and districts ought to be offering those explicitly in their plans. Now, to make up for learning loss and have the additional periods and so on and so forth, there may be costs there. But the base program ought to attend to language development, access to content, and access to core courses. So, I mean, I think those are things we all should look for with base funding.
Okay, thank you. Shelley and Molly, both of you have terrific responses, I think, very full responses to the needs of English learners in your state and district, more so than many other districts and states that we've seen. You both talked about the planning that goes into this, but what else has to exist? Did this happen in a vacuum? Suddenly you were supporting English learners in a different way. What was happening before that led to or enhanced the ability of your teams to come together, do planning, and then carry out these special supports for English learners?
So I'll start with this one. I think I have to agree. This was not something that happened because COVID happened. These structures were already starting to develop. One of the most important things that we have worked on in Metro Schools is the relationships part and building relationships with other departments in MNPS so that they prioritize English learners, and then also building relationships with our community partners so that we're able to, when these things arise, navigate them quickly, and really working to build that knowledge level of all departments and all schools so that they are able to navigate through these issues when they arise.
I think it's the same across California. The districts that had mechanisms and people in place and structures that were supporting and delivering high-quality services to English learners, those districts were much quicker in terms of being able to pivot to being able to incorporate that into their distance learning. But districts have been very creative. There was one of our districts who went out and hired a bilingual counselor specifically to reach out to newcomer students at the secondary level, knowing that some of those students probably would not engage unless they were reached out to one by one. And this counselor has reached out to over 75 families it's a small school district in our Central Valley, and has maintained contact with those parents and those students on a weekly basis. So it's that district that already had many things in place, but was very worried about newcomer students, whether or not they'd be coming back to school in the fall, and really put in place this very, very talented, very compassionate school counselor that is there linked to the school.
May I also just comment, Shelley, that the California Department of Education has a long tradition of working with advocacy groups such as yourselves to begin to shape responses. So
well, yes, and Delia, I do want to say that we are very engaged with them now with that project that I talked about, EL Rise, which has allowed us to do a lot of really good work to pivoting in this area. And if it wasn't for that, our services would not be as good as they are right now. So the support from our department has been tremendous.
Thank you. So, Melissa, as you and Julie looked at what was happening in states and districts, would you say that there are some key trends among the states and districts, or is every response different depending on the district and state and situation?
I mean, I think the key trend is that we're not seeing enough. I think the folks that we have on this call are certainly sharing some of the best examples that we've seen and know about. And, I think that what is disheartening is that we aren't seeing enough of that kind of innovation of thinking and level of partnership with CBOs, with the community. But I do think that something that is certainly, I think certainly school districts are aware of the problem and the challenges. I think there has been a lot of effort to supply access to technology and hotspots. I think there's been a lot of work on that. I think it's not perfect by any means, but I do think a great deal of the districts spent a lot of time working on that over the summer. And there is also appears to be a trend to really focus on when in-person instruction is possible to really bring in some populations of students that would benefit most from in-person instruction. So I think we are seeing that message get across. So I don't know if you want to add more.
No, I would agree. And I think another thing is a trend, maybe not such a great one, is, that schools seem to be on their own for the most part, and a lot of folks I've been talking on Twitter have been asking questions that I consider to be things that schools and districts and states really should be coordinating on and should be giving a message about what are the key strategies to use, or how should we be approaching certain kinds of assessment tasks or that sort of thing. So I've been very interested to follow all these things on Twitter, and I think it's fantastic that teachers are getting support from each other on Twitter and Facebook, and I'm sure on other media that I don't use. It really just does go to show how much of an emergency situation this is, and how it's been very difficult, I'm sure, for schools and districts and states to, really get underneath all of these things and provide some sort of foundational supports and guidance.
So along those lines, we had a question about what the role of SEAs could be to encourage best practice. All of you all, please, any one of you answer or jump in. What are some examples of either strategies or policies or suggestions that SEAs could make to help districts move along in the direction of better supporting English learners during this pandemic?
This is Julie. I'll start. I think one of the things that states can do that is already sort of a role that they play is to take a sort of the tools that they use for monitoring and to use those in as gentle and helpful a way as they can, but to say, we want to be able to, we want you to keep track of engagement of English learners and to divvy that up by the following groups of, newcomers or whatever other groups we want to look at. And we want to track the number of provisional identifications you're making, and just trying to let the districts know, sort of, again, not with the idea that metrics are everything and data is everything, but that's sort of a framework that's already in place, is for states to be setting expectations and saying what to look for. So I would think that would be one way that states could leverage what they already do well, and to really let the districts and schools know what they should be doing.
Any other comments there?
This is Melissa. I would just add that I think that states can play great leadership in really fostering these relationships and partnerships between school districts and CBOs. I think a lot of districts are already taking that on, but for example, Colorado has really leveraged some state funding that they have to really facilitate these types of partnerships to support English learners and other populations of students. So I think that's certainly an area where they can play a big role.
And in California, I have to say that our state superintendent of public instruction and his staff has really tried to has done some very good work in terms of really looking at this issue of digital divide and really working across the state with corporations to try and get additional devices out to the state. They've had millions that they have actually distributed. They have provided a lot of resources. But I do have to say, along with what Julie just talked about, that the districts are now having to write a report. It's due actually tomorrow, describing what their plan is for distance learning, hybrid learning, and when they return to in-person. And we're going to read those reports also. We're not sure that enough direction was given by the state to address the needs of English learners in those reports. And so we're going to want to see again how comprehensive that is and whether or not the state will be reading those reports and really trying to highlight what districts are doing well and where there still is a need for them to improve. I think that's a place where the state could play a real role in terms of supporting districts for additional efforts they should be taking and highlighting those that are doing a good job.
So a quick follow-up question to your comment about what's happening in Colorado with funding to facilitate partnerships. Could you say a little bit more? We have a question from someone in the audience about what does that mean? What did they do?
Respond in the chat, but so for some of the CARES Act money that came down from the federal level, governors have a small proportion of funding to be innovative with that. And our understanding is that the governor, so this is beyond the SCA, but state leadership, that they are thinking outside of the box and thinking about how to build a broader coalition to respond to the pandemic with respect to these issues.
Thanks. We had another particular question that I'll open up to everybody. It's a challenge. There are two questions. One is how you transition newcomer students to remote learning. And then related to that, I think, is how do you re-engage kids who've dropped out from remote learning? Both questions about remote learning, both in kind of tough audiences, and how you keep kids engaged, how you get them engaged. I'll open that up to you all.
So I'll be happy to start with this one because we've actually done a lot of work when we noticed this trend. We moved our technology distribution to the EL enrollment sites, had a person stationed there to have a one-on-one session with every single new student that came in, showing them how to navigate the platforms, answering their questions, and making sure they knew the various steps before they left our enrollment office. And we started that in July is when we opened up our enrollment offices again. For the second part of the question of how we are engaging those that didn't quite engage, we noticed that immediately after school started back up, and that's when we opened up our virtual hubs, and we looked at the data and the EL data in particular, and put those hubs in areas where our data for English learners, where we were able to see that students were not engaging. We made sure those families knew about those sites, had the student and the family come over to us where we were able to give them one-on-one support. And we're still servicing over 1,000 families a week in supporting students right now in our virtual learning hubs.
Thanks. Julie, I'm going to toss the final question to you. This is a tough one. It's definitely a policy question. It was a question about English learner assessment and whether there should be adjustments of exit criteria, or how you handle all that. What do we know? What are recommendations? What should we be thinking about?
Right. This is a really important thing, and I did notice that question, and I saw who asked it, and that person is a friend of mine, so I'll be getting in touch with her to talk about this more. But I appreciate the opportunity to say that this is something that MPI is really concerned with. Our center has always been looking at accountability and its place in the education world, and this is something we're going to be looking at, but since we don't quite have answers yet, I think one thing is really important in terms of EL identification is just to really make sure that kids are getting services, to sort of err on the side of keeping kids in services who are already in it, who may or may not qualify for exit under other, circumstances, making sure that the kids that are provisionally identified are getting the services. That really is the most important thing right now. And I think also not to try to do assessments under non-standard conditions, because we really don't want to have data that is inaccurate or doesn't tell us what we think it should be telling us. I would really just counsel states to use other policy mechanisms to try to account for the fact that we don't necessarily have EL assessment data right now, in terms of how the counts are done, in terms of how funding is provided, because it's, again, we want to sort of separate out those issues of individuals, making sure that we're getting the services to individuals that they need, and not letting the accountability mechanisms run how we do that. So using other information to make sure that schools are offering the services that they should be offering, and to keep track of how well students are doing beyond just the standardized EL tests. Using those things in a more informal way to support schools and districts, I think is probably the best advice that I can give at this point.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everybody in our audience today. And thank you to our panelists, Julie and Shelley especially. We've learned a lot from you. We really apologize if any questions remain unanswered, because there are several. You all have lots of questions, but we got to as many as we could in the time allotted, and we will go back and review the questions and answer individually any question that we missed. We'll try to do that. On the screen right now, you're seeing the resources that are available on our website. You've got the web addresses there. We hope you'll take advantage of these, at least to open up some of your own creativity and thinking. We know there's a lot out there. I also want to let you know that slides and audio from today's webinar will be available at MPI's website. I also want to note that for any reporters on the call who have further questions, please call Michelle Middlestead at 202-266-1910. Again, thank you, everyone. We look forward to working with you as we all sort of explore this new set of challenges, and hopefully we'll come out on top to benefit English learners. Thank you again for your interest.